No what?
Live streaming is on.
The cat's trying to lick my pudding cup.
Oh, naturally.
Yeah.
All right, hey guys. So week 13, I think we have on our virtual coffee meetings. And we're not just two already in the beginning, which is awesome. So thanks for joining us, Petru. Sometimes it's just Emmy and I talking about whatever comes to our minds. But how are you doing? How's everything?
Well, ups and downs. Generally, it's fine. I think there's some generally good vibes around. So, as you used to say once, creative juices started flowing. So.
Awesome. So maybe give us a little bit of a summary for people who might be watching this or might be joining later. What do you do? What's your startup? What's your project and passion?
Oh, well, my startup is called WeGlad, and it's a smart mobility service for people with different kinds of physical difficulties, which most severe ones could be actually physical disabilities. And it wants to help people to go from point A to point B, avoiding architectural barriers. So basically prioritizing the accessible and safe path rather than the fast one. So yeah, let's say in one phrase, like ways for people with physical difficulties. And
That's awesome.
Yeah, so we pivoted 2 times already, so it's like always starting over. And yeah.
So we know each other for a while already. We met at Techstars actually, and so I know a little bit about your company and the progress, and we stayed in touch. Not as often as I would have liked maybe, but we were all busy. But anyways, last time we talked, I remember you were basically just relaunching the company, right? You want to talk about that a little bit, because I think that's super interesting and might be something people can learn from.
Yeah, well,
whatever you can share, of course.
I had tough times, which also gave us, let's say, back some opportunities. And yeah, and in this moment, we created the company again. Basically, there was a whole restructuring on what the company does, what it wants to do, what's the business model going to be. And yeah, it's like starting. It's like creating a whole new company, so addressing the same need, the same problem. So we sort of see each other like a 2.0, solution to better address the need. And yeah, well, what I can say is that it's always hard to sort of start over, mostly when you've gone through a lot, but it sort of feels good also, because I mean you know so much already, and you feel like like a little monster that still has to grow, but your potential, which when you start the first time you just don't, and you have so many question marks, and it's sort of creepy. But as of now, let's say that we are very positive, and yeah, I mean, if you want me to talk about a specific kind of thing, just tell me. Just was quite general here.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, I think, from what I know already. But I think maybe one interesting development, which has basically kind of plagued you ever since we met, I think, was co-founder dynamics, right? Like difficulties with previous members of the team, at least. I don't know if he was a co-founder or not, but disagreements and whatnot, or at the very least, misalignments, miscommunication, right? Which I think is an interesting topic maybe to talk about in startups and projects and whatever we start as entrepreneurs on the side. I have gone through it. I don't know how many times, too many times myself, where, for me, it's often been, you get excited about something, you talk about it with your friends or with your, with your peers who you think are kind of in the same domain, right? And could be getting excited about it. And then you just get going. and all of a sudden you might have something which has value, and you don't have any formal structure, maybe, or whatever it may be, right? Like, so I've personally swung to the other extreme now, where if I start something, unless it's someone I really know for a long time already, and I trust them, like, I don't know, my wife, or really just a friend, of multiple years, who I have done business with before, I will not ever start anything anymore unless it has something in writing, right? And it could be simple. So I don't know.
What do you mean? Just explain the last sentence.
So yeah, I'll give you an example. So I was talking to two guys, and we were exploring a joint venture about a project. And like the project, I started the project like a year and a half ago, and it's kind of dormant right now. And we got really excited about working together on the project, and everyone did, right? And we kind of had this dynamic where I got excited, and then I try to push forward. They got excited, they try to push forward on different angles and just get started, right? And so at one point I kind of pushed the brakes a little bit and said, okay, well, we can get started, but what's our goal? Well, how do we structure this joint venture? Because if we just get started as friends, with a gentleman's agreement, statistically speaking, from my experience, it's most likely going to get us to a point where we're going to have a major disagreement, which will then stifle the progress of the project or the company, right? It would have not been directly a company yet, but so that's kind of a dynamic in startups I've seen happen all the time, like over and over. And it's super difficult because in the beginning you don't want to get lawyers involved and pay for legal documents and all of that stuff, right? So that's kind of, maybe you can share a little bit from what you went through and how you guys ended up solving it with the second go around on trying to avoid these situations.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's say that the goal was actually, once you go through all the, probably some are like, not all of them are like must have entrepreneurial mistakes, but some of them, let's say, are from a certain point of view. Mostly if really in the start you don't have mentors, or maybe you have the wrong mentors, which maybe are good entrepreneurs but have not done startups or stuff, so they just have completely just leap into the void sort of mechanisms, like just push and something will happen, and don't take care of many things. They just, for example, don't care much about legal and stuff, and that's what happened, for example, with some of our, let's say, more people around us that sort of pushed us. But generally the problem was us as founders, because basically we assembled a 5-people team in like 1 month or something, and we had the big luck and not luck of finding basically an angel in like 2 weeks that was like, okay, I like it, I'm going to invest, I'm going to bring friends. So it was like some sort of a member get member kind of investor, and we say, fuck, man, we did it, so let's do it, and as you can imagine, in so little of a time, you can just okay, so everybody slow down, let's just structure it all, and define things and so on. And plus, all the enthusiasm, mostly when you're first time founder, you just forget about all of that. So what you want to do is just get the money, build the company, do the stuff, and all of this was actually accelerated by this investor, which has a lot of contacts with accountants and lawyers and stuff. And well, actually, lawyers not, and that was a problem. But let's say accountants, banks, and stuff. So let's say to set up the company, which is in Italy, it's quite slow anyway. To be able to do it all that fast, I mean, to have the yes, and so basically from no commitment to hard commitment, to have the company established in basically 1 week and everything you need just ready to go, basically cut off all that, let's say, bureaucratic, but also time in which you need to think and figure things out on how you want to structure things. And let's say the young part and let's say, the dumb and the enthusiastic part of all of us was basically took over, and that's the first moment when we actually fucked up. Only we, of course, figured out it very, very later in time. And yeah, so when we started over again, it was, I mean, it wasn't even a matter of how much we want to invest in legal or should we do it, and it was just we need to. What's the best way? Who cares how much it costs? Just do it right. You don't want this to create any other problems ever. Plus, what I think is that legal investments are always good, and but also, let's say, sort of reusable, because at the end, like all the documents you create, maybe you cannot reuse them like again in the same shape, same format, but they sort of since you have to dive in a lot, into them. Mostly the first moments, they're very important, so they sort of remain in your brains, and all these concepts you sort of use them a lot. For example, when I had I don't remember what kind of problem, were in need of a tip, and you gave me a tip about how to do some documentation on the legal part before you establish and so on. So that's probably something you learn in the meanwhile. You had already a clear structure and concepting about that. And in fact, I did it, and it worked, and it was good. So all this stuff that, I mean, I think every time we had the chance to sort of approach legal for some advisory, for some structuring or something good, it's always a good moment to learn and sort of aggregate more data on, let's say, future operations. So it's always a good investment. So that's what I learned, at least. And I started to love legal really a lot.
Well, that might be an anomaly. But no, I agree, right? I think it's like that difference between, I agree, certainly first-time founders, and I made plenty of these mistakes in the beginning as well, right? If you've never done it before, how would you possibly know what the right way is to do it, right? So I agree with that. And then, like, even aside from what do we need to pay a lawyer, or even start the company legally, what do we need for that? I think the important thing is, if you are not by yourself, or as soon as you're considering not being by yourself and working with someone else, again, who is not that 5 to 10 year, or a family member, like someone who you not already trust with your life, you need to sit down together and talk about every eventuality, right? I think that's kind of that's how I look at it, because you want to cover your ass for the worst case scenario. Because of course, in the beginning, when everyone is enthusiastic, everyone always thinks, oh God, nothing bad is ever going to happen. But something bad always happens, right? And that doesn't even have to be at the fault of any of the individuals, but can be externalities, right? Or, someone's family situation changes and they just can't do it anymore for whatever reason. And that's fine, right? No one is necessarily at fault. But for the simple structure in the US, right, you start an LLC and you have an operating agreement, which legally you are not required to have. But it's very much recommended to have at least a simple operating agreement if you have more than one member in your LLC, which states exactly that, right? Like who is making what decisions, or how are decisions made? What happens if someone leaves? What happens if you take on money? What happens if you need more money, if you run out of money, right? All of these things I think are extremely important, because at the end of the day, there's a difference of having a hobby and building a company, right? And I think if the goal is to build a company, no matter how small, you need to think through those things, because you don't want to get yourself and your co-founders or employees, investors, mentors, whoever it is, whoever gets involved, customers, into a position where all of a sudden now you have to take the foot off the gas to actually figure out things which could have been thought about, in the beginning, and then having governing documents, right? I think that's kind of the rule of thumb I'm trying to use usually in these situations. Just have everyone sit down and speak about like their intentions, their goals, their requirements as openly as possible and write it all down. Find the commonalities, and then you go from there, right?
Yeah. I think like one thing we should like debunk is the fact that you say the foot of the gas, and I think it's very important to debunk the fact that in the start, sometimes you think that all this, like, I mean, it could be legal, but it could be anything, you know, that you should have to both strengthen the business, the bureaucracy, the whatever that needs to be done. Sometimes you feel like it pushes you back, you know, like even if it's like matter of 1 day or 2 days, you just feel like, damn, it just pushes me so I can do so much, you know, avoiding to do this. And it's just so stupid, because back then, I mean, because after you find out that maybe you lose 1 month or 2 months on go to market or whatever, just because you were that idiot and you know, just thought you could go faster. And then you just slow down. Sometimes you stop. On my side, it happened in different ways, and it was never fun. And sometimes it happened more times for the same mistake, because maybe I didn't cure it till the end. Maybe I didn't expect some things to happen, because it was like, I'm in a 0.01%. I was like, okay, I can get over that. I mean, so many bad things happen. What can else happen? And fuck, it happens. So, and that's why I like thinking like in the legal way, because I mean, I talked with legal that it helped us a lot, and you know, try to see the details on what to think, on what could happen, and even talking about like what happens if one founder dies, what happens if, you know, you smash your head and maybe you're alive but you cannot think clearly, so somebody has to think for you and take decisions. So going deep into all this analysis, I mean, it's not about, you know, the matter in itself. It's about educating your brain and really thinking multiple scenarios, and not just business wise, you know, because often entrepreneurs maybe have a tough time going to sleep, because they have, like, before sleeping, maybe they have like billions of scenarios going on about them marketing, and they're already there negotiating around and doing crazy stuff in their brains. But then they're so weak on some very important and simple stuff that they just avoid. And yeah, sometimes this sort of creates an internal chaos that you just have to you know, to balance. And probably this is the entrepreneurial maturity.
Yeah, I think it's uncomfortable, right? These conversations are really uncomfortable. Always.
Yeah.
I think they're never getting any better. But like, for me, it's never been super difficult personally, because it's very cut and dry. It has nothing to do with feelings, right? Yeah, yes, it's very touchy-feely topic, right? Like if you talk about equity, for example, like who should get how much and how do we make decisions and all of that, it feels very quickly, it feels unfair, because of course the natural instinct, I think, for everyone is like, oh, they're trying to get the most, right? And everyone is, and everyone should be, quite frankly. I don't actually understand why we are demonizing that, where of course you should try to have at least 51%, right? If you are not trying that, you are already telling me you don't give a shit.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? Like, you should protect your equity. And if you cannot make your case why you should have the majority stake in your company, then you shouldn't. Or if someone else shouldn't, is not able to, let's say it's 3 co-founders, right? And of course, natural instinct, I think, for most first founders is, well, we split it equally, 33.5%, right? It's probably not a good idea. And it's not a good idea because someone at the end of the day needs to make the decisions, right? And that can be done differently. You can still split the pie in thirds and maybe have, you know, the CEO, because your operating agreement states, well, there's one CEO, and that CEO makes the day-to-day operating decisions, right? And there's 1,000 ways to do it, but I think it needs to be done. It's always easier to run a company if someone makes the decisions. Of course, now I'm arguing against coStarting, actually, because for coStarting, of course, I believe that there shouldn't be any leaders. So no leaders does not mean no leadership, right? And this is kind of an interesting transition. Maybe I was curious what you guys think about this. I think we talked individually already about this, where let's say no one has majority ownership in a company, right? And everyone just has minority ownership. Then what could be the concepts on how we make decisions and how we govern the company, right? So that's kind of what one of the topics I want to figure out for coStarting, because that could avoid some of this uncomfortable stuff in the beginning, where however much you can actually contribute is how much impact you can have and how much of the decision making you get, right? Does that make sense? I'm jumping there a little bit.
You mean like you're talking about like a completely different way of intending the company as an organ itself, or okay? Oh, well, yeah. So in that case, you mean like some sort of decentralized decision-making process that, yeah. I mean, of course, it's possible, but I think it's the balance on how to do it is probably there's many variables, because then you should sort of identify maybe areas where a person should have more voting value, not by default, but in that verticality, because of the skills from one side and because of the value already given to the project, maybe on the other side, that should empower, let's say, his decision, because at the end, more verticality and more seniority in the project should somehow mean that you are better, pushing and directing towards the right, towards the right scenario. But again, I mean, we should start by, and here probably Emmy could guide us, like what is a right or wrong decision, right? Because I mean, the concept is like quite large and quite philosophical from some point of view. I mean, of course, it's driven by data. It should be, but for me, for example, it always makes me smile when I hear all these guys that always I'm data driven. I'm so data driven, and it feels like cool. And okay, data driven, it's fine. It's always good, but it's easy to be data driven when you have data. When you don't, like, what do you do? I mean, and for so many industries, there's no data. So probably if you're a pioneer, you're creating the data for your industry. So in your hands, you're shaping like what this industry might look like in the future, or if it will even take off. Because if you fail, maybe there's not going to be follow-up projects on that. Maybe if you're the only one doing, let's say, in this case, something like a company on decentralized equity, decentralized choice making, and so on, and you succeed, maybe it becomes a new model. If you do a big IPO and becomes something crazy and so on, maybe many venture capitals, many entrepreneurs and so on are gonna say, this old system feels like it sucks. I want to adopt Sven theory, and then everybody goes in because you've created the data. So again, even though you'll be one case at that point, there'll be like one case with success, and I will be able to back up my choice to the investors, saying that I want to be following Sven theory because Sven had success and so on. And once there's going to be 3 or 10, the decision is going to be stronger. So going back to what's right or wrong, and how can you can actually create an automatic process of the choice decentralization, it's probably the biggest problem, because it has to have some sort of let's say customized attributes to the decision in itself and to the person, but it has to be sort of different and that it can be shaped in base of each decision, and then it becomes too organic and less algorithmic. So there has to be a balance between the two. and I have no idea how can that happen, but it can happen, of course. So
yeah. So today's approaches that exist is, of course, we could just simply say the three of us, we start a company, and every decision is voted on democratically, right? But of course, the overhead of that is just enormous, right? Because where do you start and where do you end? Do I need to get a vote for should we increase the server because we are running out of resources, but it's going to cost $5 more? Do we need to vote on that, or do I have that authority, right? Or do we vote on how much authority someone has? But then how often do you change that? So it's a very, very complicated topic. And today we see that in DAOs in the crypto space, decentralized autonomous organizations, where that's more or less the model they're using, right? Like, so your voting power is represented by the tokens you own in the project. How you accumulate the tokens is somehow governed also by these rules, right? Like you mentioned seniority. Seniority doesn't necessarily just mean you're the longest participant, but you're maybe the most impactful participant. How is that determined? Now the problem space shifts very quickly, right? Because of course we also need to somehow value that, right? Like, how do we measure it? Not everything is easily measurable. So, but that's kind of how it works today. So let's say simple DAO on the blockchain today, which this what we are doing right now is now our DAO, right? Our decentralized autonomous organization. By participating, we are actually getting points, tokens, right? Somehow, karma, whatever you want to call it. There's actually already plugins and tools, maybe not for Jitsi, but for other meeting software, which measures how long someone talks, right? And how much they interact on a group call. So maybe that is a simple rule. Is it a fair rule? I don't know, but it's a simple rule, right? Whoever talks the most gets the most points. And that translates then in voting power.
It should be who talks best.
Right. But that, again, you see very quickly, like, how do you determine that, right? Like, you don't know. So you need to start with something which you can do, and then maybe put another human layer on top of it, right? Maybe there is, like, we measure that, and then maybe there is a quick vote at the end, right? Like, you close the meeting, you need to say, okay, who had the most impact today, or something, right? Like, yeah, go ahead.
I think that like it has to be a process. Like, you're going to go through so many different iterations of this new system to find like an entirely new thought process, right? So you're not just changing ownership of a company while still operating under the same, capitalist socioeconomic structure, right? It's the same like when I talk about communism or whatever. We're not just going to keep the same beliefs, but shift into like all owning the same amount. So many things are going to change that, maybe even employment isn't going to be considered the same, to where you're not arguing about these things that don't necessarily have to do with you. I kind of went on a tangent there, but yeah, I think that part of the big focus should be like making small switches and finding out what is going to work, and not being afraid to do something differently, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So this is interesting, because in a perfect world, right, we would just throw everything out the window and start like with, the idealistic concept we are thinking of. But of course, the goal needs to be to build still a valuable company. There's still a capitalistic thought behind it, right? So I think a lot of that is, from the like maybe not communism, but like socialism or communes, right? Like how they are run, or cooperatives are a lot of times similar. But a lot of them, they don't have capital gain as as the actual goal, right? Which I think it still is to an extent. Now, hopefully it's slightly different, right? Because maybe we can change the value chain a little bit, where I think our generation talks about this a lot, right? And I've been asked this plenty of times from my mentors before: why do you want to make a lot of money? Because that's usually the answer, right? Like, why do you want to start a company? It's like, well, I want to make a lot of money to be financially independent. Well, what does that financial independence give you, right? Like, what do you want to do with your life, with the life of others, or for others, like whatever that is, right? And maybe we can switch that around a little bit and bring those values to the center of the organization as well, which I think we do see in a lot of experiments today, right? I think the crypto space is certainly a part of that. Like, the contributors there, they believe in it, they love it, because they also earn crypto, right? They could have a much easier life just developing for a different company and getting dollars, but they believe in the space. So that's, I think, a part of it. But how do you do that? Like, so the crypto space, I'll try to forget about it for a second, because it's such a big threshold for most people, right? Even just talking about these principles without crypto already seems so daunting that you say, well, I think I'm just going to join a company which does something similar without all of the overhead you're talking about. So how do you make it enticing, right? And I agree, like Petrus said it nicely, like if there was already this one experiment which ran and built a successful company or something valuable, whatever that means, as a case study, then sure, now you have something to base it on and kind of run with. But we are the first, right? In this case, or I don't know, the first one I know of. I'm sure 1,000 other people are trying something similar. So how do you make these incremental changes, like you said, Emmy, and just experiment with it while you are in such an early phase?
Yeah. I mean, you also, like, you just have to get people thinking in a different way, because it's such, like, most people, the way that we consider like ownership is such a pillar of all of our, like, the way we live our lives, right? And even just that change is going to take so much mindset shift, right? That it's like just starting the conversation, getting people involved, I think is going to be a huge part of it, because like I said, you have so much to figure out that it's impossible for one person or the three of us or whoever to do it and imagine, it on a larger scale.
Yeah, I agree. Probably the goal, I mean, general goal should be what's the fastest yet tiniest and most impactful, let's say, iteration that you can do that rings the biggest bell, This is probably the thing. So what can you do that sort of shakes something? It can be a small shake, I mean, compared to the potential, but it has to be a big shake from some points of view that sort of moves some things. But I mean, getting back to the choice, what came to my mind is, for example, I'm having, I mean, not a tough time, but at least the market sure has it, and but it's sort of changing. But let me say what I mean on the impact assessment and the impact metrics. Let's say measuring. There's let's say a big problem in the market, because let's say that because companies have to sort of do GRI reporting standards, non-financial disclosure, and create basically all this corporate social responsibility that somehow creates impact on the communities, on the biosphere and everything. And there's like a big question mark on how do you actually measure all that. And sometimes the answer is no idea. I mean, you can, and but it's sort of hard to really put into numbers things that are not always, let's say, easy to analyze. But again, it sort of like last 10 years, it mostly last 5. all impact industries are sort of trying to better, dive into the micro externalities of the impact and sort of measure it like bit by bit. And there you can actually do stuff. And for example, with WeGlad, we also try to do that, to create a measurable impact and try to quantify it. And what I think is that, let's say, if we do this parallel transition to decentralized choice, maybe it's not the weight in terms of verticality, in terms of the impact and seniority that should be analyzed, but it's like about monitoring the micro positive externalities that can somehow could be measured, and then get this data and that put it back into the process, and then to create something that uses this kind of data to better reattribute the weight of the choices and their decentralization. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's
yeah. Let me see if I understand what you were saying there. So basically, determining the value by actually measuring the impact, right? Like, so let's say it's like A/B testing. Let's say we have two pictures we want to test on social media, which has the most impact for conversion, right? So kind of like looking at which contribution makes the most impact for the organization at any given point in time. Now, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, like, you cannot just say this stuff does. I mean, let me do like a practical case on WeGlad, which I understand better the field because I operate in it, so it's easier. So basically, we let's say utilize or let's say subsidize the stakeholder, the corporate stakeholder time into impact, which means that basically we use their cell phones, their time, and their time used in mobility to sort of do a call to action through which they can, let's say, do data entry on architectural barriers on the streets when they move and walk around, and do some data entry on the facilities when they eat the pizza or going to a bank or in the post offices, by let's say updating the accessibility of the places. Now, doing, let's say, mapathons and corporate social responsibility challenges with the corporates basically allows you to have an army of very motivated individuals that are sort of linked to the company's purpose. Usually companies that do good CSR have their stakeholders very linked to their purpose, or at least are able to sell it to the employees and the stakeholders. So the fact is that if you map through WeGlad, then you create impact. You use the life of people with physical disabilities, right? And let's say, okay, but then how actually this happen? How do you measure that? So then you have to go into all the externalities. So they're internal and external, and then you have to go deep on each one. For example, each time you actually map an architectural barrier, we can say that the way we can measure it could be the fact that, okay, during this corporate challenge, 1,000 employees mapped 2,000 or 200,000 architectural barriers, okay? But this number is not an impact in itself. It's just how many entries there have been on that topic. So then the impact assessment could be on what is the average injury that a person with disability has because of the not accessible environment. And for example, like many times here in Italy, people just go into a hole in the ground, fall down off the wheelchair, smash the head, and could die. It happened like during Texas, happened in Florence, for example. And so there's a lot of injuries like that in my community. Like we're building now the first 200 early adopters, and in like last 3 months, there are like 10 injured people because of architectural barriers. It was like crazy shit. So if you really analyze that, for example, then you can go back to the metrics that were inputted by the company and by stakeholders and say, actually, this year, by your stakeholders in this challenge, I was able to sort of avoid 2 people from smashing to the ground and dying. Okay, so I saved 2 lives. What is the value of that? Well, okay, it can be philosophical and so on, but let's say that can also break down in how much time people saved into going into an accessible path rather than moving around 20 extra minutes to just figure out how to avoid the obstacle. So again, time saved, which can be accumulated to all the people and all the paths generated, linked to the architectural barriers you mapped and so on. So I think like these extra steps into analyzing and breaking down more detailed impact is sort of the possible analysis that you can do on the choice decentralization. So what is the, let's say, the output of the impacts output? Because that probably it's very small, but it's very defined and it can be measured. And then you can use it back to say, okay, now that I have some data on that, I can say that these types of choices give me this type of outcome, so that it means that it has more or less weight. So yeah, this is like the parallel. I think I probably sort of did too big of a circle.
No, I think it's a good example. I think it's a little high level, right? Because I'm trying to now think through what does that mean. I think I like the general gist of what we're talking about here, which is like that impact-driven governance, maybe let's call it for now.
Yeah,
now how do you measure the impact is the big.
Let's call it. Sorry for interrupting. For example, let's analyze it from a shift from, let's say, capital gain to impact gain, for example.
Yeah. Now, I think that's good. The problem, which is still hard to see for me, at least at this point, is it's the same problem in a different space, right? Like, how do you measure impact? So instead of measuring the value of the contribution, now you want to determining the value of the contribution by the impact the contribution had. You're shifting to measuring the impact, which actually I would gut feeling say is probably by an order of magnitude harder, because of course in any given organization you have, I don't know, 100, 1,000 contributions going on at a time, right? So now linking those through is like a whole new startup in itself. You see what I mean? Like, and it's individual per organization, right? So like your example makes a lot of sense because you already determined your space for like what impact means for VGLAD, right? Like, and I agree there's many different interpretations of impact. Human life, certainly, time saved, or even just you helped. You mapped 200,000 and 13,000 people on our system interacted with the barriers you mapped or avoided them or something, right? That's an impact. Exactly. But now how do you generalize that, right? How do you generalize that for VGLAD, right? Like, how do you measure the impact of any individual contributor for any idea, for anything they do for VGLAD? Not for the customer.
Yeah, but this is, for example, one thing that I want to do. So, for example, I want to gamify all the contributions in the app. So at first I said I want to gamify and give you.
Not for the app. Forget about the product, right? Well, I mean, you can't really forget about it. But let's say you have a copywriter, at VGLAD, like just the organization VGLAD, not the product VGLAD. Like, yeah, how do you measure that?
We can step up. I mean, let's say on the user side, at first I thought I want to, let's say, give value and analyze the impact of each contribution. But in the start, it was about data entry on the map. But then I said, but actually users can interact and talk to them. Users can help each other. Users can post data because there's like a social part of the app and so on. All right, so then I said, I want to sort of give value to all these kinds of interactions. And then talking about the copywriter and so on, like what he does somehow impacts. I mean, you sort of can do A/B testing also on like basically and the very, let's say, maybe stupid way, but like how things go without and with a copywriter, right? So this is like a very basic black and white assessment. But then the fact is that it's true that probably we want to generalize and see like the bigger picture and just sort of be able to generally map, but I think it won't work because you want to, I mean, it's about creating something very granular, very specific, and that it can sort of shapeshift and be applicable on many things, you know. So it's not about analyzing the network of choices, it's about analyzing the node and seeing what's the relationship between other nodes. Because if you understand that, I mean, for me, to understand the impact of a company and how to analyze that, I started by analyzing what's the impact of one individual. And then that sort of applying it to bigger scales, and then getting up to. So that's probably, if you see a beach of many grains of sand, it's hard to really identify it and let's say number it. It's just one, and it's big, and it has its own ecosystem and blah blah blah. But probably the fact is about not necessarily counting all the grains of sand, you know, but at least studying one or two of them, and you probably will understand the rest of the beach. But at a micro level, a level of the elements that actually constitute the beach itself. And I think this is what we want to do here. You want to understand what is the most microorganism atom of node of this decentralized sort of approach or company or organization to then build up. You need to. I think you need to understand the brick. Like, what's your smallest brick made of? And so
it's a contributor, right? It's a contributor, but there is already like 20 different types of bricks.
I don't know if it's a contributor or a contribution, or what makes the contribution happen.
Right, that's fine. That it can be. I think it can be a contribution, which is actually definitely more accurate, because it doesn't matter who you are; it matters what you do, right? But there is certainly at least 20 or 200 or 200,000 maybe different types of contributions, right? Maybe even more than that. Now, you can't. I think. At least I don't think you can't build a system which has a solution for measuring every single one of those. That's not going to work, right? Because like you just said, they're so unique. I mean, you can't, certainly not if you try to measure the impact, because like I said earlier, you're going to have maybe 10 copywriters. But how do you measure the impact of any individual if they release blog posts at the same time, right? And this is certainly a marketing problem we face in regular organizations today as well. And I don't think there is a proper solution for this, because, if you have a marketing campaign, and I was dealing with this in my old company, right? Like, if you run an out-of-home marketing campaign and you run at the same time for the same product, 5 other campaigns, well, how do you determine one campaign's impact? You can't, right? Unless you make something unique about it, right?
Yeah,
like
but
I think coupon code or something.
I think maybe before starting to analyze like what's let's say the co-impact of two choices or two things that are happening at the same time, which is definitely hard. First, we need to understand basically what's the additional value of one action. All right. So this is what I'm saying. Let's say that if you wanted to create a big beach of many grains of sand, it's complicated. But if there's no beach, and we all want to create a big one, so there's nothing. All right. So the fact that you put 2 grains of sand, then Amy puts 10, and I put 1, you see the difference between before and after, right? And so it's 13 grains or it's 20 grains, and whoever comes after is like it's more, and you can notice what's before and after that, but it's because you know that it's made of grains of sand. So I think you need to understand what is the grain made of.
The analogy is too simple, right? Because in this case, we already know the individual, the block you said earlier, right? Because it's not just grains. That's the problem. Because it's actually more like building a satellite, or I don't know, building a universe or something, right? Because every single contribution is so significantly different from the other that in itself is already hard to value, right? What do we do today is we assign hours, right? Like, okay, 1 hour, it took you 1 hour, 1 hour is worth $50. And then we start by saying, well, Emmy's hours are worth different from Petru's hours, right? But that's the best system we found so far.
I have an interesting conundrum, and I might be branching off into a completely different area here. But so last night we were watching this. This is a robbery, right? And it's the biggest art heist in history, and it's a $200 million art heist. These guys just stole like 13 paintings or something from this museum in Boston. So, thinking about that $200 million of art, if I was a security person who could have stopped that from happening, I would have saved $200 million, right? But what if I was a WeGlad contributor and I noticed that there's a crack in their ramp and I saved a life? You know, how do we compare life versus capital? You know?
Or anything else, right? Time saved, like that. And that's the thing, right? Even the impact part is already so significantly different from depending on what the goal is.
Like, obviously, if I change the security system, some automated something would credit me much higher than anyone else because I saved $200 million, right? But is that intrinsically more valuable than something else, anything else?
Well, it's the classic problem, right? With the one child on this train track and a whole village on this train track or whatever.
Right.
It's the same issue actually, because if you stick with your robbery example, you could, instead of comparing it to WeGlad, compare it to the actual security guard, right? Mm-hmm. So there's two security guards. You can either save your colleague or the money. You know, I mean, and yes, it is a different topic, but it's an interesting one. But yeah, I don't know. Like, so generally, and Ray's the fly on the wall today, so maybe he has a thought on this. We are all over the place so far. So Ray, I'm not sure if you're really following along, but I guess we started with the thought of, how do we, like, one part of coStarting is about, decentralizing, no leaders necessarily, right? Like anyone can be a contributor. How do you approach something like this? I don't know, in the case of coStarting, maybe I would love to be the guinea pig with coStarting as a company and get it to the point where it's enticing enough of a structure of a new way of working for people to just become contributors. But in order for that to happen, we need to somehow assign value. Every contributor needs to be able to get something out of it. So these are the one of the still core questions for coStarting's bigger vision.
Well, hey, I think that the question is kind of like the question about the beach, right? What does the beach look like? Where are you trying to go? And then with that, you get some greater insight as to how to get there. But the goal is so big, right? If I only got a couple grains of sand, how do I make this enormous beach? And the answer is something smaller. This is where the metaphor of rocks becomes really useful, right? The classic time management demo. And looking at rocks on a 90-day and 1 month level versus, like Jim Collins' BHAGs, they're more at the 10-year level. The 10-year level, that's the beach, right? That's the big change you're looking to affect in the world. You might measure that through external metrics, and certainly laggy ones. But but just because you can't measurably change that in a short period, it doesn't mean that you're not doing right. You need to be asking, well, what are the steps on that journey? And how can you be making progress on those? How do you measure those steps so that you can know that you're going the right way? And then how can you evaluate whether what you're doing is actually generating that progress? Steve Blank in 4 Steps says that the job of a startup, the difference between a startup and a regular growth company or whatever, is that its job is to deliver the answer to a question. If you don't know what your question is, very hard to come up with an answer. And I think what you all are kind of getting at is, in order to create a business or an enterprise of any kind that has meaning, you need to know what your question is. And once you do that, you can ask, well, how can I kind of measure at that? And once you have that, how can I kind of make progress towards those intermediate goals? And then it's probably the case you're going to do a bunch of things over the course of your career that are going to make that progress. But then the question is just, hey, what can you most easily do first, right? What's the one that gives you the biggest leverage based on the assets you have in hand? And then you make that progress, you answer that question, and you go on to the next.
Yeah, so I guess I like personally need to think more. Like I don't know if you were there already when Petra said that someone just needs to do it, right? Because how my head works right now is I'm going on the meta level of this and trying to answer the question, how do we do this repeatedly, right? Like how do we do this decentralized approach, coStarting approach generally, building like a methodology or processes or tools, whatever it might be for that, right? Like what's the general answer, I guess, is what I'm trying to answer. And of course, one approach to try to tackle that is by just experimenting a lot with 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 organizations in different ways, and then collecting the best offs, the best practices, and that then becomes the methodology. I know why I'm not thinking that way, because of course that's a life's journey, right? And I want it now.
Like the song says, you want it all and you want it now. But I would actually challenge your premise. It is not the case that coStarting is leaderless. It is 120% the result of your force of will. You might want to eventually create something that's leaderless, but coStarting as it is today does not meet that criteria, and that's okay. What you can be doing is using your force of will, using your leadership to draw people into these, learning from them what works and what doesn't, to turn those lessons into content, to turn those content into widely accepted best practices, then allow success to happen without your force of will, and that's how you get to be more leaderless. But the idea that you can be doing a startup in sort of this bootstrappy way, right, where you're not really applying a lot of somebody else's capital, but you're applying a lot of your own time and wisdom, call that leaderless, I don't think is quite right. And endeavoring to do that, as I've seen others do, just sort of sets you up to think that everything you're doing is wrong, because that which is intrinsic to this exercise, right, which is your own personal focus and force of will to do the extraordinary, you're now counting against your goal. Allow that to be successful. Create those first steps, right? Evaluate yourself in terms of how you're doing on the first mile marker towards your journey, even if you think the eventual thing isn't going to involve that outsized force of will, or hopefully anybody's, because of the collaborative aspect.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, it's definitely a good point. And I mean, you never know what the answer is, because it might as well be creating the roots of a successful organization, which you never know, like how deep the roots should be, and then it could be, like the king who gives the crown to the population. It could be like applying, for example, the decentralization in a specific moment, which actually can be adopted within the company, because at the end, like what you think could be the best possible organization, I mean, it's not like 100% guaranteed that it's a completely shared idea, right? So it's easily shared and adopted in the moment that it creates like tangible value for anyone that should choose to adopt it. And in that moment, it means that it sort of vibrates this kind of value, and it's natural to adopt it. So probably that's one thing also, that you never know, like if it should be created from the root, so that the roots should be already going to that direction. It could happen like middle way, it could happen in the end. Yeah, you never know. But as what was the name? I can see it, Ray. Okay, Ray. Right. Yeah, as Ray said, I mean, for example, I know a person which I like a lot, and he always says, connected to the question thing, it's really important, like what question you ask yourself, and probably also, as that guy said, is that if you don't find the answer, then try switch the question.
Right.
But,
Right. And that's interesting. So what I'm hearing there, or well, how that sounds to my brain is because I set out with coStarting this big, 1,000 ideas, right? Like different kinds of things. You all heard different aspects of it so far. What happened, and I totally agree with Ray. Right now, it's not leaderless by any means. It's really all hinges around me as a person. Probably you could argue. But it's because I started on one end, right? Like, so kind of what we're talking about today doesn't exist at all. There is not even an experiment for it with what coStarting is today, right? coStarting today is all about the transparency part of the bigger methodology, right? So I think, there's a little bit of a semblance on the website and whatnot. It's all about building in public, being transparent, impact-driven, collaborative, right? So I think there's like 4 or 5 concepts. My hypothesis is that if you combine those, you have more resilient and better organizations, whatever better means, right? Like, so there's in the book, The Spider and the Starfish, or whatever it is. No, it's not that. That's not the title of the book. Is it? I don't remember. Anyway, one of the books I'm reading compares it a lot to the one of the Indian tribes when they were fighting against the English, right? So one of the tribes held them back forever because that's essentially how they operated. They didn't have a traditional leadership structure. They were distributed, and they had more of the, I guess for them it was more spiritual leaders rather than generals, right? And they were massively better in actually defending themselves than other Indian tribes who had more of the general top-down approach. So that's one of the reasons why I'm thinking, it's a very small part of it, by combining all of these things, organizations can become better in the future. But yes, I agree, Ray, that right now that none of that's there, and I guess for myself, I need to kind of, this is why this meeting is, by the way, there was the intention to talk about the bigger picture a little bit more, and then during the week, bring it back to, okay, now I need to get to cohort 4 and to a couple of peer groups or whatever the intermediate goals are, the pebbles, right, on the beach, to start building something and I guess what I used to call it building my stage, right? Like I'm building a stage right now. You need a certain amount of following or awareness out there that at least the concepts, the discussion is being heard, right? Because if it's just going to remain the 4 of us talking about it, then yeah, sure, it might have an impact on the 4 of our lives, but it's not building anything really. And that's of course true for any company.
Well, I also wouldn't put too much emphasis on this having to be a series of live conversations that have a whole lot of different people to them, unless you're looking to generate content from them. I mean, I actually think there's a worthwhile exercise for you, which is you should go watch all the video you've created since January. Go ahead and watch it in 2x. You probably know what everyone's saying. You'll be able to get it. YouTube offers this with pretty good functionality. Go in, do it, take notes. Allow coStarting to be revealed back to you, right? And what are people doing? What's working? What's not? What are the patterns you're seeing? This will allow you to actually move things forward, right? Because what coStarting will do will tell you, like, if you think there are 5 principles to coStarting, but you're finding one of them is what's actually getting traction, it's actually making change, well, then that's probably the one you want to double down on. You can think all 5 are important, but that doesn't mean you have to do them all at once. But from where I sit, the big advantage you create is the data set, right? You're creating data from the experiences of all of these people, these virtual coffees, but even more so the cohorts. You're making them all happen in public, which is one, you validating a theory that being transparent is good, but on the way, you're creating a whole bunch of data. This is data that nobody else, you may have made it public, but nobody's paying attention to. You can tell that by looking at the follower count on YouTube. So take early advantage of that. See what everyone else is saying. See what you're saying to yourself. And I think from that, you may get a great deal more insight for a moderate investment of your own time.
Right.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And probably one of the good questions could be, guiding like your next steps, like what you want to gather data about. so that you can then actually analyze it and review it.
Yeah, you guys are definitely right. And I'm making slow progress on that, but I am taking a little bit of what I'm seeing so far. For today, very terrible edit, but at least there is one of those nuggets now on Twitter. And I do need to go through it, right? Like to the same point you made a couple weeks ago of turning these into a newsletter, right? Like, I think whatever the medium is, I think curation, I totally agree, and multiple people said it, would be valuable. Curation, taking the content, breaking it down, making it more accessible and more digestible, rather than having other people have to watch 40 hours worth of content already, right? So I do tend to also think that is probably a valuable next step for coStarting, whatever that means. So I'm still trying to figure out how I want to tackle that. Right now, yeah, rewatching it and learning from it makes sense, but then coming up with a strategy on how to repeatedly doing this crunching on selection of the content on the nuggets and all of that going forward, right? Makes sense.
Yeah. By the way, here in Italy, there's a guy, a startup, I think it's called cohort. He started, I think, 1 year ago, and the guy is really, I like him. He basically started interviewing basically 300 startups or something like this. And I think interviews are like 40 to 1 hour, 40 minutes, 1 hour. But basically, he sort of does some pills, like from 30 second to 1.5 minute pills, like 3-4 from each video, and then put this to LinkedIn, YouTube, and so on. And sort of tries to have like good titles that are sort of connected also to the vision of cohort. Wants to show about startups, and it's going good. I like his style. I think it's going to hit well, and it's interesting. So I think there's a lot of like, if you want to sort of push a specific type of content out, there's a lot of like stuff we discuss, and some things can be let's say more philosophical, some more well, fuck it, the word doesn't come out. And it's good, to sort of put it out. It would be good. But anyway, read this book we talked about the EXO.
Yeah.
I think it's all good. So one thing, like the MTP, this sort of massive transformative purpose scheme from the EXO formula, it's really good because there's a lot of contribution on the exponential organizations, and I think you want this decentralized thing to be exponential, right? Because this is the point, that it takes over fast. And so there's a lot of things that you can apply, and things that had already been tested on the market and on many communities, because EXO is all about creating communities and contributors on a massive scale. So there's a lot of probably, let's say, thousands of years put into like last 10 years between different kinds of professionals that try to test and get out stuff from it, that you can sort of adopt for coStarting. And I think there's stuff that could work, and you can adopt it on your own style and create new stuff.
Yeah. No, this is fantastic. Awesome. So I think we're coming up on the live streaming limit, so I'll stop the live stream. Give me 1 second.